everybody. Good to see you all here today, and I hope that God has blessed you this past week and that you look forward to all the good things that God may have in store for us this week. Really glad that you're all here this morning. Let me stop and take a little time to thank everybody who came to our Wednesday night planning meeting last Wednesday. We planned a few things, like Mr. Bob mentioned, about having our hayride and cookout. We're shooting for the 18th of October. So, be looking forward to that. There's a sign-up sheet out here in the foyer if you want to help bring any kind of food or anything for that. But I do appreciate everybody that did come to that. It means a lot that you were there. And if you didn't come, we're going to have a planning meeting next month, so try to come to that if you can. And this coming Wednesday is going to be our prayer meeting, so I want to invite everybody to that. Try to be a part of that. We'll get together and pray as a church. I think that would be good. But getting to what we're going to do this morning. For our lesson now, I want to try to answer some questions that some of you have put in. Do the best I can to give you a biblical answer to that. We try to use this period every month, this second Sunday of every month, to answer your questions. So I have a few questions. I'm ready to look at them. If you're ready to look at them, we'll go ahead and dive right in and get started. So the first question that I have, it's pretty short and sweet and to the point. And it has a pretty powerful point, I think. But the question wants to know, when does talking about somebody become gossip? When does talking about somebody become gossip? In other words, I guess we're asking, when do you cross that line into gossip? Well, that can be a pretty fine line if we're not careful. If we're not watching what we're doing or what we're saying, we can easily cross the line into gossip. Now, I think there's something here as we consider that question. There's one thing that we really need to think about. Things like gossip or slander or just any of those types of things, rumors, all of that. There's a core idea behind all of that. And that is hurting somebody. That's kind of the root idea really behind gossip. All these forms of bad language. It's saying something that's going to be damaging to another person. And I'll go so far as to even say this. I don't care if it's true or not. It can still be hurtful to someone. And it can still be something that we don't need to be going around talking about and saying. I hear some people say, well, it's not gossip because it's true. What I'm saying about them is true, so therefore it's not gossip and it's not wrong. Well, you know what? It can be as true as the sky is blue, but if you're trying to damage somebody, if you're trying to run their name through the mud, you don't need to be saying that as a Christian. So the root idea behind gossip or any of those forms of bad language is that it's something that's going to be damaging to a person. So if we want to avoid crossing that line into gossip or whatever, I think the number one thing we can do, is check our heart before we speak. Am I going to say this because deep down I want to sting that person a little bit? A lot of times we get stung. Somebody says or does something that kind of hurts us, or kind of gets under our skin, and so in a subtle way we want to kind of hurt them back. So that's why we start saying things that we say about people. They've upset us. And we feel justified in that, don't we? Well, if they've hurt me, I have a right to hurt them back. We feel justified in that. But, just because somebody may have wronged you doesn't mean it's okay to wrong them back. Two wrongs don't make a right. Kind of have to consider that. You might remember the old statement, It was popular back years ago, WWJD, what would Jesus do? Well, I think we need to remember WWJS, what would Jesus say? Before you go to say something, you might want to stop and consider, would Jesus say this? If you say to yourself, no, he wouldn't say this. You're supposed to be his follower, maybe you shouldn't say it either, right? And sometimes, like I said, we feel justified in doing that because they may have hurt us. And sometimes we feel justified in gossiping or saying something damaging to somebody because, why not? They're not around to hear it. So if they're not here to hear what I'm going to say, then I guess it doesn't count as anything bad. It doesn't matter if the person you're talking about is there to hear it or not. If it's damaging, hurtful language about somebody, you don't need to do that. So let's check our heart, right, before we go to speak. I think that will help us a lot. And also do this. Remember the golden rule. In Luke 6:31, Jesus said, do unto others as you would have them do to you. That's the golden rule. Everybody, most Christians are familiar with that. Well, if you wouldn't want somebody saying that about you, should you be saying it about them? When you go to talk about somebody, just stop and think. Would I want somebody saying all this about me? Put yourself in their shoes for just a minute before you speak. I think if we follow these basic principles, that will help us from crossing that line. I think we cross that line whenever we get into trying to hurt somebody. Follow these principles and that can help you to avoid that. And here's a good illustration. Here's a good story that might help you. There was a lady one time, she came up to the preacher and said, I'm quitting this church. He said, well, why are you quitting the church? She said, because there's too much gossip going on. Everybody's gossiping about everybody. And now they got me gossiping. It's rubbing off on me. And I just can't stand it. This church is falling to pieces with gossip. So I'm quitting. And the preacher says, okay, I understand. He said, but could you do something for me before you leave? She said, okay, I'll do something for you. It's the least I can do. So the preacher hands her a glass of water filled all the way up to the brim. He says, take this glass of water and I want you to walk around this church 3 times and don't spill any of it. She didn't understand what that was about, but she said, okay, I'll do it. She gets the water. She walks around that church 3 times and she comes back and says, I didn't spill a drop of it. And the preacher asked her, he said, okay, as you were doing that, did you hear any gossip? Did you tell any gossip? She said, no, I didn't hear any gossip. I didn't tell any gossip because I was too busy focused on that water and not spilling any of it. He said, well, how about you live your life focused on Jesus? And if you're still so busy being focused on Jesus, you won't have time to tell gossip and you won't have time to hear gossip. Keep your focus and keep your heart on Jesus, and that'll probably help you with all this gossip problem that's going around. After she heard that, she stayed at the church. I think that's a good principle in that story. Like a lot of the problems that we have come because we lose sight of Jesus. We get caught up in all these other things, and that's when these problems start to happen, and that's when people start to gossip or say hurtful things about others. I want to share this verse with you. Look at Proverbs 15. This is a good verse that lays out a very sound principle for us. But Proverbs 15, verse 1. Proverbs 15:1. A soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Soft word turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Now, this verse is not hard for me to remember because my mama used to quote this verse to us when I was a kid. Me and my siblings would start fighting with each other, or we would start fighting and arguing with her. And she would remind us of this verse. Using harsh words just stirs things up. But it's a pretty solid principle here. Soft answer turns away wrath, but a harsh word stirs up anger. Your words are either going to be healing or they are going to be hurting. Before you speak, you better stop and think, what are these words going to be? Are they going to help or are they going to hurt? Are they going to heal or are they going to inflict wounds? Are they going to be soft and kind and good, or are they going to be harsh and cruel? And also, like verse 4, he says, a gentle tongue is a tree of life, but perverseness in it breaks the spirit. Your tongue can give life or it can break somebody's spirit. Think about those things before we speak. And I think if we were more cautious with our words, gossip wouldn't be a problem. And let me also say this. Gossip is one of those sins that sometimes we easily tolerate. You ever notice we categorize certain sins? There's certain sins, if you commit it, boy, you're out of here. We're dead serious on that. But gossip isn't usually one of those things. Oh, that's old sister so-and-so. You know how she is. She got to gossip. We just sort of turn a blind ear to it. That's okay. You know, it's one of those sins that we're used to. I heard a guy say it like this one time. He says, when's the last time you have ever heard of somebody being disfellowshipped because they were a gossip? You hear tell people getting disfellowshipped for this or for that, but what about gossip? What do we ever do about that? Sometimes nothing, sadly. But you know, gossip is a serious thing. In James chapter 3, James talks about the tongue and how damaging our tongue can actually be. And James took it pretty serious. God takes what we say seriously. You know the old saying, sticks and stones can break my bones, but words can never hurt. That's not true. I know you say it, but we're taught that, but it's not really true. Words can hurt people. So I think if all Christians were cautious, we could avoid gossip, and it wouldn't be that big of a problem. Well, let's move on and look at the next question that we have here. The next question comes from the Gospel of Luke, if you want to go ahead and go to that direction. Luke chapter 16, to be more precise with you. The question wants to know, what is the meaning of the parable of the unjust steward? What's the meaning of this parable? Well, I think the first thing we need to do to answer that question, obviously, let's go to the parable and let's just read it together and we'll analyze it and try to understand it. So Luke 16, I want to start reading with you in verse number 1. Luke 16, verse 1. He also said to the disciples, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him that this man was wasting his possessions. And he called him and said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do, since my master is taking the management away from me? I am not strong enough to dig, and I am ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do, so that when I am removed from management, people may receive me into their homes. So summoning his master's debtors, one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? He said, 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down quickly and write 50. Then he said to the other, how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. The master commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. For the sons of this world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. And I tell you, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. Let's pause right there. What does this mean? Is Jesus saying that we ought to be dishonest? I mean, if you look at the parable, this is what happens. Jesus tells a story. There's a man, a wealthy man, who has a manager. He's getting ready to fire his manager, and the manager says, well, wait a minute. If I'm going to lose my job, I've got to figure out what I'm going to do. I don't want to do manual labor, and I don't want to beg, so I've got to come up with something. So he goes to the people who owe his master and he cuts their bills down. You owe this much, well, slice that in half. He cuts their bills down so that way, when he gets fired, those people will look at him and say, you were so good to us, slashing our bills like that. Come on in, we'll take care of you. And Jesus even says here in the parable that even the master was impressed by this. The master basically said, I know you're costing me money by cutting everybody's bill, but I got to admit, you're pretty smart for doing that. So what's the point of this? What is Jesus saying? Is Jesus saying to the church, is he saying to Christians, you guys go out here and be dishonest like that too? I don't really think that's what he's trying to say here, because remember, the Bible is all about truth. Even in the Old Testament, one of the 10 Commandments was don't bear false witness, which basically means tell the truth. In the New Testament, in Ephesians 4:25, Paul says, let every man speak truth with his neighbor. So God's all about truth and telling us to speak the truth and be honest and fair with people. Well, what's this parable mean when he's talking about this unjust steward and all the dishonest things that he does? And Jesus even says in verse number 9, make friends for yourself by means of unrighteous wealth. Well, I think to understand this, there's a couple things we got to realize. Number one, what Jesus is doing is he's pointing out common practices of people of the world. That's what it says in verse number 8. It talks about the people of this world. The sons of this world are shrewd. In other words, he's pointing out this is the way that worldly people often behave. They think about themselves, and they come up with clever ways, like this man in the story did, to take care of themselves, right? People are often shrewd and wise, maybe dishonestly, but they are that way in order to take care of themselves. Worldly people do that. Worldly people have gotten themselves into situations like that. They've gained dishonest gain for themselves. You know, if you have gotten yourself into that position, you've made dishonest gain for yourself, what should you do with that wealth? You've gained it dishonestly, but it doesn't mean that you can't use it righteously. What I'm saying, I guess, is when you read the parable, I think the main point of that is, like with this steward, he gained friendship from these people through dishonest means. He's gotten himself into that position through dishonesty. But if you want to turn your life around, you say, you know, I've gained all this money and all this position and stuff dishonestly, but now I want to serve God. I want to turn this around and use it for something good now. Things that have been gained through bad means can still be turned around and used for good means, if that makes sense. Jesus isn't saying that we should be dishonest. But if you have been dishonest and you have gained things through dishonesty, you can turn it around. I think is essentially the point of this. Because that's what he talks about in verse number 8. You may have gained dishonest things through dishonesty, but use it for good. You may have gained things from darkness, but now you need to turn and use it for the light. Is essentially what he's saying here. The main thing that it seems that he's really pointing out here is wisdom. We have to be wise in how we use things that God may have blessed us with, wise in how we deal with these things. I think that's the essential meaning of this parable. If that makes sense. Now, I want to do this, though, for a little bit. I want to kind of make an application of this. We've sort of talked a little bit in previous lessons about reaching out to people with the gospel. When we do that, we need to have wisdom and shrewdness about us as we reach out to people with the gospel. That's one thing that the parable, I think, tells us here. How do you do that, though? How do you use wisdom in reaching people for Christ? Well, I'll say this. For one thing, we got to make sure that we understand that we don't have a one-size-fits-all mentality. What I'm saying is, what may work to bring one person to Christ may not work to bring this person to Christ. There's one gospel that we teach. That doesn't change. But the way in which you approach somebody with it may be a little bit different depending upon the person. Now, I have seen some people who had the attitude where they said, look, when I talk to somebody about the gospel, I'm going to let them know quick, fast, and in a hurry they're going to hell. I ain't got time to hold their hand or anything like that. I'm just going to let them know they accept or they don't. You know what? That might work for some people. There may be somebody you come up and say, hey man, you're going to hell, you need Jesus. That may work for them. They may say, where's that baptistry? Get me in there. But for a lot of people, that's probably not going to work. And sometimes when we have that one-size-fits-all mentality, we lose a lot of people that if we had just used a little bit of tact with, we could have gained for Christ. We just used a little bit more wisdom, a little bit more shrewdness, and a little bit more patience. We could have gained them for Christ. And I've seen some people also have the mentality of, if I'm going to try to convert somebody, I'm going to give them X amount of time. And if they don't convert by then, I'm dropping them like a hot potato. I'm writing you off. And I'm going on to the next person. They get the same X amount of time. And if you don't convert within that period of time that I think you should, I'm done. Again, you got to be a little more flexible than that because some people may take a little longer to see the truth than others do. And that's okay. I look at my own life, and I'll be dead honest with you, there are certain truths in the Bible that it took me, I'm talking years to come to terms with and understand and accept. So I get it, that there's going to be some people who it takes a little more time with in order for them to accept Christ and see the truth. You know, I've been thick-skulled before. I've been hard-headed. And I'm not going to ask you if you've been hard-headed because I know you have been. We've all been hard-headed about certain things, right? So we've got to be wise. We've got to be shrewd and understanding as we deal with people in the gospel and understand that we can't always have a one-size-fits-all mentality with this sort of thing. We've got to be wise when it comes to that. And also, you know, let's talk about this. In the parable here, he also talks about possessions. You may have gained possessions through dishonesty, but you can turn and use it for good. Let's think about using our possessions to serve God with and bring people to Christ. I've noticed something. We have no trouble, as Americans many times, buying things for ourselves. If we want to go out and buy new clothes for ourselves, or go out to eat, or go on a trip, or go over here and do that, do this, well, we have no problem doing that for ourselves, do we? We're throwing $20 bills around like they're free. No problem if it comes to buying something I want. But here's somebody who needs help paying a bill. And all of a sudden we get a white knuckle grip on that $20 bill. And we're not so sure if we really want to help this person with that, right? And if we go to feed somebody, like if we go to feed ourselves, we're getting steak dinners. Here comes somebody who's hungry and they need to be fed. Well, if I'm going to feed you, you're going to get paper plates and bologna sandwiches. You know, we got to get cheap when it comes to evangelism. But I'm going to tell you something. That is the wrong thing to do. Because aren't we supposed to be representing God here? That's what we're supposed to. This is the most important thing we could be doing. Trying to bring people to Christ. And it's paper plates and bologna sandwiches? I don't think so. Like, if we're going to be trying to do good for God and represent Him. You remember there was a principle in the Old Testament with the animal sacrifices that they had in the temple. God said, don't bring the weak and the sick and the maimed animals. Bring the good ones. Bring the best, right? So when we go to offer sacrifices of service to God, how about we kind of have the same mentality? Right? If I'm going to help this person and I'm going to do good, I'm going to try to make an impression on that person, a good impression to represent God here. This verse stands out in my mind, Psalm 34, verse 8. Psalm 34:8, taste and see that the Lord is good. That's what we want people to see. That the Lord is good. We want to represent that to them. Now, don't misunderstand me. I talk about, paper plates and bologna sandwiches and stuff. I'm not saying you can't use that. I mean, the point I'm making is, don't always be overly cheap. We're going to have our cookout here. Guess what we're having? Paper plates and hot dogs. But you know what? I want it that way. Could you imagine us out there with fine china eating our hot dogs at a cookout? That's not going to work. We want paper plates and stuff for that. That's how it's supposed to be. So I'm not saying you can't use that stuff. I'm just saying, let's remember we're trying to represent God as we're doing these sorts of things, right? And I also want to say this too. I know that whenever we try to do good for people and bring them to Christ, there's concerns that we have. You say, all right, well, if I give somebody money because they say they got to pay a bill or buy groceries, I don't know about that, because what if they don't really use the money for what they say they're going to use it for? What if they end up going out and buying drugs or buying beer or something like that? So some people use that as an excuse to never help somebody. Well, I'll give you just a simple piece of advice on that if that's what you're really worried about. There is a simple way that you can cut through all of that. If they say they need money to pay a bill, instead of just giving them the money, why don't you go and pay the bill? If they say they need groceries, what do you need? You go to the store and pick it up for them and bring it. You know for sure then it's being used the right way. And if you do give somebody the money, and let's just say hypothetically they do misuse it. You know what? One thing you have to realize with that also is that's on them. I gave it to you for this purpose to help you, and if they're going to misuse it, that's on them, right? You do have to kind of come to that point eventually and realize that. And then sometimes, too, I think one reason we get a little cheap is we say, well, I don't know if I really need to spend a lot of money here, because if I spend too much money, I won't have any money left to help anybody with. So we think that justifies us being cheap. Well, I understand that to a certain point. You got to be concerned and think, well, I can't spend all my money because then I won't be able to help anybody. I get that, but that can be a fine line you have to walk here too, because sometimes you get so cheap that you die on a pile of money. In other words, we'll sit there and save all our money so that way we'll always have money to spend. But then we end up not really doing much of anything with that money, and nothing ever gets done. We think we're being good stewards, right? I saved your money. We're kind of like the one-talent man in the parable who held on to that money, thought he was doing his master's will, but the master said, you should have used it. Put it to use for me, not just hold on to it. So it can be a fine line to walk there. I understand if you have your money and you say, I don't want to waste it all, and I need to say, I get that. But be sure that we are using it, I guess is the point that I'm making here. I'll tell you this story. It's kind of related to all this. Years ago, this was like when I was a kid, basically, there was a church at the town we used to live in, right next to the town we used to live in. And the church got left a lot of money. And the people were excited. They said, hey, we can use this money to evangelize with. Well, some of the leaders of the church stood up and said, no, we are not going to use that money to evangelize. That money will be used to make sure there's always a church here. We're only going to use this money to maintain the building. We will not be using any of this money to evangelize. We'll have to find that money somewhere else. Well, I'll tell you what ended up happening because of that. Immediately the church split. Right there because of that. And years ago, I went back to where that church was, and there was like a handful of people there. And now, I don't even know if the church even is in existence anymore. I don't think anybody hardly goes there. It may be completely dead at this point. I don't know. But I looked at that, and I'm thinking to myself, yep, building is still there, but no church is home. Because people kind of lost sight of what they should have been doing, serving God. That can happen in our own individual lives as Christians. I'm not here to spend my money just on myself. things I want. I'm here to use it to serve God with, and do things that can help please Him and lead other people to Him. Sometimes we lose sight of that as Christians. We get hung up on paying the bills. We get hung up on things I need in my own life. And I got to put a roof over my head, right? I got to put food on my table. I understand that, but you're here to help people and lead them to Christ. Let's keep that in mind, right? So going back to the parable again, it's talking about wisdom here. People of the world are wise when it comes to these things. Why can't we be wise when it comes to serving God? That's a point I think we all can take. But I hope this answers these questions for you. And if for some reason you have more questions on this, more comments or thoughts, you can always see me afterwards. I'd love to talk to you about that. But before we end, we want to make sure we offer the invitation. If you're here, you're not a Christian, we give you that chance and opportunity to obey the gospel, become a Christian and follow Christ. And if you are here, but for whatever reason you've strayed away from your faith, we're here to help you come back as well. If there's anything we can help you with this morning, please let it be known while together we stand and while we sing.
Jesus calls us o'er the tumult of our lives, while restless sea